Hi, my name is Daniel Miller, and I'm doing my presentation on cannabis advertising and why it is important to have regulations put in place for these types of advertisements, as well as regulations that have already been put in place for similar advertisements, the legal precedent, and what this kind of regulation does to benefit society. Regulating advertisements is important because advertising is the primary way companies spread information about their products, as well as how consumers find out about products they may want or need. Without regulation, misleading advertising, or just plain out false advertising, would go unchecked, leading to poorly made products and misinformed consumers. This is also important for restricting how many ads you are able to see and where you are able to see them. Without advertising restrictions, this already constant stream of advertising would become even more rampant and unbearable. Current advertising restrictions put in place by the FTC crack down on advertising placement and content based on what is being advertised. Advertising on all platforms must be truthful without deception, meaning anytime something is false or exaggerated, said like that because you can't see my air quotes, is displayed, a disclaimer must be shown. Anytime actors are present, it must be mentioned, etc. This is just to make sure that consumers are getting actual good, decent information about the products they are being advertised. Similarly, prescription drug ads have several restrictions they must follow that others don't. All ads about drugs must contain at least one intended use for the product, its generic name, acetaminophen for example, and any and all possible side effects. Another set of restrictions the FTC has in place is for adult products. Things like alcohol, condoms, self help hotlines, if you catch my drift, etc. These types of ads cannot be played during children's programming and must be aired during content that is relevant for the intended audience. Lastly, the type of advertisements that have undoubtedly the most restrictions, and for good reason, tobacco companies. These are the regulations that I'm basing my argument for cannabis advertising on, given the similarity between the two. In the early days of broadcast, tobacco advertising had very little, if any, restrictions. This was before the health risks associated for tobacco use were well known. And back then, everybody smoked anyways. Tobacco advertising was everywhere. Billboards, magazines, newspapers, and broadcast mediums were employed to advertise these products. Early TV shows didn't have modern day commercial breaks like we're used to. Television programs and sometimes entire stations were sponsored by either a particular product or products. One notable example is from this early episode of The Flintstones.
They sure work hard, don't they, Barney?
Yeah? I hate to see them work so hard.
Yeah, me too. Let's go around back where we can't see them.
Gee, we ought to do something, Fred.
Okay? How's about taking a nap?
I got a better idea. Let's take a Winston break.
That's it! Winston is the one filter cigarette that delivers flavor 20 times a pack. Winston's got that filter blend.
Yeah, Fred. Filter blend makes the big taste difference, and only Winston has it up front where it counts. Here, ahead of the pure white filter. Winston packs rich tobaccos specially selected and specially processed for good flavor in filter smoking.
Yeah, Barney, Winston tastes good, like a cigarette should.
The Flintstones has been brought to you by Winston, America's best-selling, best-tasting filter cigarette.
Winston tastes good like a cigarette should.
Not only were cigarette ads rampant on broadcast television, them being shown directly in kids' programming was a huge issue. This was subject to change once the government began to crack down on smoking, however. In the mid to late 60s, when the U.S. government began its anti-smoking campaign, some of the earliest decisions made were regarding tobacco advertising. The reasoning behind this was, if less people were subjected to smoking ads, then less people would want to smoke. And if children were less exposed to smoking ads, eventually there would be no more smokers in general. Some of the restrictions the FTC put in place regarding tobacco include the banning of all smoking commercials on broadcast media. Cigarette companies are still allowed to advertise, although they must contain a warning from the Surgeon General. And the legality of where and how they can advertise varies state by state. An act passed in 1997, agreed upon by 46 states, banned the use of billboards to advertise tobacco. Cigarette companies themselves also agreed to pull their ads from newspapers and magazines that are accessible in school libraries. Cigarette companies are also no longer allowed to use cartoon-like characters, to quote the FTC, to promote their products. Notable mascots that fall under this category include the Marlboro Man and Joe Camel. These types of characters were found all over the place in early tobacco ads and were taken by the government to be targeting children to get them interested in smoking. Like with the Flintstones clip shown earlier, tobacco companies were, and still are in my opinion, notorious for targeting children with their advertising, but making it seem cool to smoke. Similar to using cartoon characters, tobacco companies are not allowed to put their logo on clothing or make any sort of affiliated merchandise. This is to prevent as much exposure to the brands as possible without banning the ads outright. Other notable examples of tobacco ad restrictions include their inability to sponsor public events like sports or concerts or Formula One/NASCAR drivers. Here is a timeline of tobacco ad restrictions. In 1970, the Public Health Cigarette Smoking Act was passed, banning all cigarette ads on broadcast television starting January 2nd, 1971. The last ever cigarette ad played on television was a Virginia Slims ad aired at 11:59 p.m. on a showing of The Tonight Show. In 1984, the Surgeon General's warning was required to be put on all cigarette ads and products. And in 1986, this was the year smokeless tobacco ads were banned from broadcast platforms. Now, I spent a lot of time recapping the restrictions on tobacco advertising because I feel that this legal precedent is vital for how we should proceed with marijuana advertising. I feel that these products are so similar to one another that the restrictions put in place for tobacco products should just carry over to cannabis. If all the restrictions already in place for tobacco are either copied over for marijuana or simply rewritten to include marijuana advertisements, there would be very little, if any, need to write new laws restricting these ads. Also, this is a way to keep these restrictions fair and not have tobacco companies cry foul that other products similar to theirs have less restrictions placed on them than they do. Not only does the regulation of these ads limit the exposure to children, it upholds the government's duty to protect the public's interest and health. Personally, I feel that these restrictions are the easiest and best way to regulate the advertising for these products. I do feel that the inability to produce their own merchandise is a little extreme, because if a kid has no prior knowledge of a product, seeing a stranger wear that logo would do nothing more than confuse them. Thank you for listening to my project. I do appreciate it. I have been Danny Miller. Good night, Vietnam.
Well, there's a guy, named Reggae Bob. He sits around all day, you know he ain't got a job, because he's smoking up, yeah, and having fun, cause he's into peace. He never carries no gun. Rasta, yeah, now from head to toe, cause he knows Jah and Bob Marley too. Yeah, he's always happy. He's never